For the next couple of weeks, we saw each other almost every single day. You would think this would make things stale fairly quick, but I kept using my imagination. One weekend we'd go to the water park, another day we'd go camping into the deep woods. Sometimes we would just Netflix and chill, and by that we'd actually watch a movie together. Of course, the more interesting stuff happened a lot, too. When Jolene wanted to make the plans, we usually went out dancing with a few of her friends. Of course, that reminded me of I had some of my own. We made it a point to take at least one day a week to hang out with all of our friends. Every once in a while, she would introduce me to someone that wasn't quite human. At first, it was just passing friends, mostly harpies and alike. Now, they don't look anything like the video games would make you believe. They're usually very small and cute little females. They travel in packs, mainly for protection, and only transform when they want to get away from someone or something. Harpies are a bit bitchy when they're in their groups, of course. Probably is some sort of pecking order thing. I swear that wasn't a pun. Once separated from the flock, they are actually quite pleasant to talk to. A bit submissive when you're one-on-one, but Jolene would never leave me alone with any of them. Even though she clearly had to use the latrine, she never left me alone with any of them. I didn't find out until after we had left the club and the harpies had moved on, that harpies tend to group towards, group intercourse. Though usually acting like lesbians in public, they will willingly take advantage of any alpha male to produce the best offspring. Given the amount of area they cover, it's a good thing they only lay one egg a year. Another interesting fact is that they're some of the best sources of information, and of course rumor, outside of certain clans. Seems like our secret got out rather quick. My blood ran cold as they told us that every clan is interested in finding out how a new succubus was created and not born. Though we never did tell them it was by accident. I guess I would have to figure how to tell the creatures from humans. It wasn't easy at first, since they blend in so well. Also, some creatures haven't changed back into their monster forms in years. This makes it difficult for even their elders to tell them apart from the crowd. At least one time, a dark elf bumped into me by accident, and neither of us could tell at first, though we knew something was just a little off. We kind of just looked at each other for a few moments, and then Jolene broke the silence by calling him by his name. She used his human name, Josie. Yeah, I'm using Jose from Jose because I didn't like that. And it was a good thing, too. I still can't pronounce his elven name without help. We spoke for a bit over lunch, and I was able to learn a few things about them. First is that they don't actually alter their appearance. Instead, they use a type of magic camouflage to hide their elven heritage, i.e. the Spock ears. It's a small matter since the only thing they're really hiding is those wonderful Spock ears and the color of their eyes. As long as they're constantly trimming their nails, they don't have to worry about covering their hands. Elven culture is also very weird in all the different clans and how they interact with each other. In truth, I'm still trying to figure it out. I wouldn't find out until later that talking to him was a big mistake. Less than a week later, as Jolene and I sat down for a movie, I noticed a rather large group enter the theater. Now, normally, I wouldn't think this would be an issue, but this was one of those crappy rom-coms, and the group was all men. At least, I thought they were. I was on the edge as I watched them move into position around us. There was only a few more couples in the theater who had been given cash by one of these men to leave, and leave quickly. Only one guy gave them any trouble until he took a look around and saw what was about to kick off. As one of them walked up, Jolene noticed what was going on. She started to mention something and then realized how focused I was on the situation. I simply said, "Honey, it's time for us to leave." As we tried to walk out, the man in a suit and a fedora stood in our way. He tipped his hat to Jolene and began to speak in an accent I can only describe as a mix between Celtic and a southern drawl. "Sir, ma'am, I need you to come with me, please," he said in that pleasant and almost cheery voice. Jolene simply told him to get out of our way because we were leaving. He kept his calm demeanor the entire time, but continued to insist. I didn't say anything until I felt the pistol into my back. At least, I thought it was a pistol. I calmly said, "Maybe we should follow him out." She looked confused at me and then saw the look on my face. We walked down the short staircase to the exit ramp, and as I turned the corner, I saw that the one on my left was now on my right, and the one that was behind me was now in front of me. There was also a piece of wall between me and the one holding his weapon. If I was going to make a move, this was it. I pushed Jolene out of the way and lunged at the man beside me. With all the strength I could find, I struck him clean on the side of the head. To my surprise, his jaw came clean off along with most of his upper teeth. The one that had his pistol in my back had holstered it so he could walk out unnoticed. He was now reaching for it. What he didn't realize is that he wasn't the only one packing heat. 4 shots into his torso and he went down into a heap. I turned my pistol to the others, who were also drawn by this point. I fired multiple rounds into the closest one he also dropped, and then took a few hits myself. But this new body was able to tank most of it. Don't get me wrong, there was still plenty of damage. As I fell back behind the wall, I suddenly heard Jolene scream in agony. I turned, and the pleasant man was magically pulling energy out of her. Rage took over, and I lunged at him. I couldn't shoot him because Jolene was in the way. I was in such a blind rage that I didn't even know that I had transformed. In 10 feet, or possibly less, it took for me to get on top of him. My full weight landed on him, and I began to strike him. I didn't understand it at the time, but it felt like I was hitting solid rock. I then found out why Jolene screamed the way she did. Whatever that bastard had done to her, he was trying to do to me. His hands were not even touching me, as it felt as though blood and organs were being ripped through my skin at an alarming rate. This was the point I was glad I was in a blind rage. I was able to quickly focus on him and begin to strike and pummel him into the ground. After a few of the longest seconds of my life, he finally stopped. But I didn't. I used every bit of strength I had and ripped his arm clean off his body. I was so mad I didn't even feel the taser prongs enter my skin. I did feel the electricity, though. It was enough for me to lurch backwards in pain, but not enough to put me down. I could hear them yelling, "What the fuck?" Or, "Why is it working?" And then, "Shoot him! Hurry! Shoot him!" As I ripped out the prongs, I bolted at them and was able to rip into the first one easily as I swung. I pounced on the second one and felt his ribs break as I landed. As I went for the third, I felt his bullets rip into my flesh. Adrenaline kept me on my feet as I began pounding him into the ground, quite literally. I turned around, still mad, and what I saw happened to Jolene. Then I was greeted by a welcome sight. Jolene had transformed and used her claws on the last 2. Unfortunately, this was all she had. A few seconds after the last one fell, she collapsed on the ground. She had not passed out, but just totally spent on energy. I picked her up and we walked to the polite guy as he was desperately trying to keep from bleeding out from the loss of his arm. This is when we got a really good look at him. His dark red hair and pale complexion looked up at us, and those pointy ears came into view. "A fucking blood elf," she said. "I should have figured." I was a bit confused at that. I asked, "I need some context here." She turned to me and just said, "I'll explain later." She started transforming, and I looked at the blood elf for a few moments. I brought up my foot as though I was going to crush his head. He covered his face just as I dropped my foot, and then I crushed his head. At least, the other one. He shot up in pain as blood started to cover his pants. Not sure how much damage I did, but I doubt his mate is going to be happy with me. We left the theater as fast as we could. Our torn clothes got some strange looks as we crossed the parking lot. I was grateful we decided to go out the emergency exit because as we were leaving, several police vehicles came screaming in. As we got on the highway, I turned to Jolene. Okay, now tell me what the fuck is going on? She took a breath, then began to explain. I told you before that creatures you know of the fantasy are, or were, all real. Back there, that was a blood elf. They drain essence from other creatures to sustain themselves, or use it for magic. I was confused. Blood elf? You mean there are others? She looked concerned at me. There are many more that have either been keeping in the shadows or they've been hunted to extinction. I almost happened to be our kind of a millennia ago as we were hunted. She seemed deep in thought at what she had just mentioned. Normally, I wouldn't push on the subject, but I needed answers. So why did they come after us? Jolene looked frightened as she answered. Oh, God. She paused for a moment before saying, a blood elf can analyze the essence of anything they pull it from. And since you were the first to not be born a monster, but transformed into one, at least not a vampire or something, they will want to know how to do it. Confused, I asked, can't they just have more children, or are they like us? An elf female can only get pregnant once every decade or so. Their biology is very slow in that regard. Also, if one elf can increase that numbers faster, then the others would have to give them much greater advantage. Now, the war dog in me was listening very close. You mean tactically? I asked. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. I wanted to comfort her, but we had another problem. Several cars were coming up behind us real fast. I told her to buckle up because this could get sporting real quick. They came up and flew past us doing well over 100 miles an hour. I will say my heart skipped a beat as they went by. I guess that they figured we'd be going back home as fast as possible, not considering that we didn't want to be noticed by the cops. Plus, I tend to drive in the right lane anyway, so lucky us. As we got close to our exit, Jolene said she needed to call her mother. I grabbed her purse from her and told her that our phones being off is probably the only reason we're still alive. Last thing I needed was an electric bullseye on my ass. Then I got an idea. I bypassed our exit for another mile. Down, there was a rest stop. I pulled in and we turned our phones on and tossed them out the window. Sucked because I kind of liked that phone. And I just kept driving. I kept going to the truck stop a little way further down the highway. We went in just to grab a few items for the road. Then took the back roads to an old friend's house that lived fairly deep into the woods. It took a few hours since he lived all the way in another state. When I pulled in, his motion lights turned on and his dogs just started barking like mad, though that didn't last long since they knew my car. When I got out, they growled at me a little, and when they saw Jolene, you could see the hairs stand up on their backs. I simply gave them the command to calm down. It's in German, and proceeded to open my hood and disconnect the battery. I did this so they couldn't track the GPS in the car. The door opened, and I'm looking down the muzzle of an M14. I just looked up and said, "We come in peace. I'd rather not leave in pieces." With that, the weapon lowered and a voice called out, "You usually call first. Must be in some pretty deep shit if you're showing up here tonight. In the middle of the night, too." He motions to the car, "And following my advice." And then he looked at Jolene. "Who's this?" This is my girlfriend, Jolene." He looked her up and down. "Are you dragging her into this, or is she dragging you?" I grinned a little and answered, "We both stepped in this one together." With that, he grabbed a radio in his pocket and gave a code for everyone else starting to appear. Jolene was very spooked at the amount of people that seemed to just walk out of the darkness. Now, succubi have excellent night vision, and even she didn't see them coming. We pushed the car into the barn and went inside. The dogs didn't stop snarling at us the entire time. Once inside, I told them everything and why we needed to hide for a while. Of course, they didn't believe much until Jolene and I transformed right in front of them. Had to tell the kids to leave first, though. Given full transformation, Jolene and I were pretty exposed. They said they could help, but our timeline was a week at most. I assured them it wouldn't even take half that time. I have to take a side note here and tell you about my friend. He's medically retired from the Army and runs a type of prepper business, if you want to call it that. Most of the instructors are his families. They live on the compound with him. The majority of this is subterranean, spanning about 500 meters in any direction. There's even an old missile silo on this property that he almost is done remodeling. There he holds classes to give people a taste of bunker life. Then, when not teaching classes, I have helped him out on a few side jobs, most of which were fancy type of guard duty, but some are a bit more interesting. Now, back to where we are now. Jolene and I spent a lot of time on our scarier forums because so many of them wanted to see. I didn't care much anymore, though one of the guys suggested that I come on a job he has. I would be easier if I couldn't just scare the person into not doing anything stupid. I said I would think about it. In reality, hell no. The less people that know about this, the better. We talked for a while before I realized something was pulling my tail. I mean, literally. I turned around and realized that one of the young ones had worked up the courage to literally pull my tail. I retracted it quickly because I really didn't want them going and doing anything to it. That is when I realized my wounds had healed over. In fact, a few people said they watched my scars disappear over the hour or two that we spoke. With that little distraction, it was time to go to sleep. Jolene and I were handed some robes to wear as we transformed back, though now we had to eat something, like bad. I told them how hypermetabolic the transformations are, and they gave us some leftovers, which didn't take long to disappear. We woke up the next morning to the smell of eggs cooking. The next morning was interesting as the ladies began to talk, relatively suggestively, at the table. It seems as though they had not even considered the possibility of seeing a succubus, let alone being able to talk to one. For us guys, it was much more business in our speech as we talked about what had gone down today. Being that it was the off-season for his company that had to reset a lot of the items to be ready for when the big group started coming through. Even though we spoke business, I could see the questions behind their eyes. I was sure I'd be inundated with questions as soon as we went outside. Sometimes I hate being right all the time. We didn't get halfway to the barn to let the horses out before the questions started rolling in. Mainly, it was how I could get such a beautiful woman to go out with me, let alone stay with me. You see, I was an introvert for a long time, and I had issues trusting people in the past, so relationships were few and far between. Also, my choice of women in the past have not exactly been good. I tried to use humor to get them to knock off the questioning. Note to self, that doesn't work with this crowd. When we got to the barns, the animals went silent. Just like the dogs, they seemed to want to keep an eye on me the entire time. It was almost like they could feel the apprehension of having a monster so close. Then again, I know this isn't the first time one has been around. Interestingly, I saw that the cattle would take up position between me and the calves. I tried to play this off, but I know the other guys noticed as well. While working that morning, the questions never stopped. Nor did the test. They might have thought they were being sneaky about it, but asking me to throw hay bales that they just accidentally knocked down on top of the loft was a bit obvious. For those that don't know, getting a standard hay bale 10 to 15 feet is about the limit of the average human male farm worker. In my new form, I could easily double that without transforming. One of them asked me to transform to show them what I could do, and I had to ask, "So you brought a half a dozen subs with you, as in grinder sandwiches?" He looked at me weird, and the others reminded him of the hypermetabolic state that happens when I change form. He then changed the subject on why Jolene's monster form and mine were similar, but they had some very obvious differences. In particular, he asked why she has talons and I don't. I responded with, "I don't know. Maybe God just wants her to be able to carve her names into my back or something." At least this time the joke didn't fall flat, and the chuckle was enough to ease the remaining tensions. By the time we finished with the animals, along with cleaning up and reorganizing the barns, sheds, the ladies had come out with a snack for us. It was a hot day, really not used to the climate is all, so the light snack and drinks were very appreciated. As I walked out of the shed, this one was for storing fuels and chemicals, I saw Jolene and my jaw dropped. Her hair was freshly washed and blew in the breeze. That summer dress she was wearing suited her very well and seemed to fit basically perfectly. The light breeze made it sway, and the sun was almost directly behind her, making it almost transparent. I had to pause to keep myself from just taking her right there and then. Thankfully, I was keeping it together, and thankfully, she was too. The shed was really hot due to the fact that we had shut the ventilator fans off to clean them. I had taken my shirt off, and thanks to my condition, I'm rather toned. Everyone seems to get what I was going on and took the snacks as we stared at each other. After a few minutes, I handed a cup back and kissed her right on the cheek. "I'll see you later," she said. As I pulled back, she smiled. "Make sure you take a shower first," she said. I paused and could hear the other ladies saying similar things to their men. That's when we realized that we stunk of chemicals from the shed. We all had a good laugh on that one before we went back to work. It wasn't long before the guys started showing how they could feel the sexual tension in the area. Now, I sort of thought this might be a thing when I was with Jolene's family, but I really didn't give it much thought. I thought about it off and on throughout the day. We didn't see the ladies again until dinner. The children's brought us lunch. The kids kept asking me to show them my transformation, but I kept having to tell them no. Felt a little bad about it, but I'm not walking around bare-ass for the rest of the day, not to mention that I don't want to do that in front of the children. FYI, they were aged between 14 and 5, so just no. Thankfully, the men got what I was getting at and helped me defuse the situation. Though once the children left, it was brought up that the teenagers could probably handle it and I should show them the transformation at least once before I leave. I told them I'd think about it. Considering that many of the teenagers, most of which were not delivering up our meal, were being trained to work as supernatural beings that could help them out a lot. I told them again I would think about it. It didn't matter if it was for their research or not, I was still hesitant. For the rest of the day, it was rather uneventful. I was able to pay them back for their kindness with my labor, although I think having me replace the starter of the tractor by myself was a bit much. If it wasn't for my condition, I wouldn't have been able to hold the damn thing in place and bolt it in at the same time. When I climbed out from underneath, they actually applauded me. Jerks. I just didn't want any man to do it. I flipped them off, they laughed, and we moved on to the next item. Before going into the house, we all hit up the outside shower. Thankfully, the pipes had been in the sun all day, so we didn't have to wait for them to warm up. Inside, it was clear that the ladies had been busy. It was a veritable feast out in front of us. All of it either grown or harvested on their own land. Damn, I haven't had food that good since I was a kid. After dinner, the children cleared the table and were washing the dishes when they called a few of their older ones to the dining room table. They brought the coffee with them, and I found myself in the middle of a meeting, which was odd. My old friend started talking business, as in their side business. As in, turns out there had been a lot of new contracts to capture or terminate different monsters lately. They still didn't know what was causing the uptick in creature sightings or why things had gotten so hostile. One of the teachers produced a folder full of material along with a laptop computer. He hooked up the computer to a small projector and began to show us what they had found. As it turned out, this kid knows the dark and deep webs so good he can navigate it without being detected, although he wasn't the only one. Two others, another male and female, had gotten hold of a ton of information. They talked about a job my old friend did a few weeks back with a creature I just wasn't ever familiar with. When I asked Jolene, she just shrugged. Instantly, I was focused on getting as much information as possible. They talked about movements, migrations of creatures, cryptids, and monsters all over the planet. It was so detailed that we actually had to take a bathroom break. When we came back, the young ones addressed me and Jolene directly. As it turns out, they already knew about the clans and how the hierarchy functioned. Also, as it turns out, many of the different clans worked together to stop any spread of information. But, of course, nothing is foolproof. From what we gathered, I had a price in my head. Jolene did too. But the fact that her mother was the head of the family made it dangerous to even accept this contract like that. Apparently, word had gotten out how I transformed into an incubus and just wasn't born one. With few exceptions like vampires, zombies, werewolves, and half-breeds, this doesn't happen. Many of the clans were looking to increase their numbers, so they put out contracts to capture me. Those that feared this information getting out had put contracts to kill, usually with an addition to destroy the body. Not something I was looking forward to. They noted that over the past week, the price of me had gone up. Since we had avoided capture and gone to ground, the price had gone up substantially. The kicker was that the price goes up too fast, then most people won't even consider the contract, as the target is considered far too dangerous. Kind of hard to spend money if you're dead. There was even video of us taking out the Blood Elves team. Everyone in the room looked at us concerned. We simply looked at them and said, "What?" One of the men said, "You should have shot him." I looked in his eyes and said, "That was the last time. I don't carry extra mags." The last item of business they brought up was an extremely well-paying contract. This one was to take out one of those same creatures my friend had faced before. This time, though, the contract was paying nearly 9 times as much. This made the entire room stir with worry. They all knew the dangers of monsters and cryptids and how much these contracts usually were. I remember him saying how difficult it was to take out a dozen or so of these things. In fact, the entire team was at the table and talked about this subject in length. It was decided that a few would at least go to the initial briefing to find out more information. This had an extra bonus because if you just sat in on the meeting, each person is handed an extra $500 just for attending. Made them seem desperate for attention and attendance. I would attend even if there was a price in my head, though Jolene wouldn't be. I asked her to stay behind on this one since I wanted to keep her safe. However, if this turned out to be a well-paying contract, we would have enough money for Jolene and I to disappear for years. Concerned with the information we had just received, Jolene and I talked into the night about what we should do. I kept wondering if we should take the job and leave or just stay on the farm for a while. We went back and forth for a while because even if we were discovered, it would take fool's errand to try and take this place by force. Hell, even the best sniping positions were rigged with explosives, just in case. Call my buddy paranoid if you want, but he knows how to make an assaulter's life hell. Regardless, we need the money, so if nothing else, at least we can get the 500. I attended the meeting with my old friend and some new kid he had hired to work with him. Apparently, they had both fought this type of creature before and come out on top. The kid didn't want to talk about it, though. Turns out his previous team had been wiped out by these things in the last skirmish. Nothing like a little revenge to get you in the mood to kill something, of course. Not that I would know anything about that or anything. Now, to tell you what we'd be up against. These creatures are called siren heads? Whatever. Called that due to the large speaker-type organ on top of their heads. Supposedly this is how they communicate. And also send a loud noise, so loud that it can disorientate their target. At high enough volume, it would cause the target's ears to pop and then bleed from the eardrums before causing paralysis and eventual death. Last time they faced these things, they took out a nest of young ones by baiting them into an ambush and either burning them or taking them apart. As they explained, the older they get, the tougher the hide gets, and the smarter they get too. I got to see video of the battle and noticed that most of the young ones, anywhere from 8 feet to almost 30 feet tall, would charge right at them, right into the line of fire, and had been ripped apart. The last one must have been the oldest because it almost ripped the entire hunting party a new one. However, now we would have to face the adults. The bonus was there was only going to be 2 or 3. It is suspected that it's in their nature to only have an alpha male that's allowed to survive with only 1 or 2 females. Who knew siren heads like threesomes? Once the briefings were over and given a chance to back out, and a few people, most likely knowing they were out of their depth, left while the majority stayed. They started with a more in-depth briefing from there and then asked what kind of equipment we wanted via a request form. I still remember the look on the guy's face when I handed them my request form. He actually asked me if I was joking. I responded with, "My jokes may suck, but this isn't one of them." We got back to the compound and immediately called a meeting. It was time to get everything ready. Our intel children already had gathered additional information on these things that those in the group that had faced them before, began to compare notes. Turns out you can't just shoot these things and call it good. At least not if anything designed to take out people would be used. Most of our group had requested high caliber weapons, 50 caliber or higher. One even requested a 20mm cannon, but was told these things are already learning to avoid big guns like that, or to take them out quickly. It's not like we can hide them from the sight. That made me wonder about the vehicle-mounted weapons. My old friend told me that they were not used to seeing harpoon-style weapons, so they would be ignorant enough to get close, at least close enough. The worst thing about these things was the fact that unless you hit it perfectly in the center with a bullet, all you're going to do is piss it off. Due to the very round shape of the body, unless it's a perfect impact shot, it would just glance off without piercing it. Isn't science fun? Most of the guys still requested Desert Eagle and Barrett 50 cals, though I figured those were a last resort. Best chance we had was to get them on the ground and hit them with incendiary munitions. My friend made a special request that I thought was even stranger than what I had requested. Regardless, there would be 6 of us going. There would have been more, but one said he wasn't ready to deal with something this big yet, and 2 had not fully healed from the last contracts. A couple of the teenagers volunteered, but they were told they just weren't ready yet. Not yet. I could tell they were a little angry at this, but the fact that they were even part of the briefing showed that they were getting pretty close. When it was all said and done, I went out to the back porch to think. Jolene came out a few minutes later and handed me a drink. As I began to drink, she wrapped her arms around me. "You know," she said, "you don't have to do this. If we really need money, I can get it from my mother." I quickly responded, "And put them at risk too? I don't think so." She looked at me puzzled. "Remember the Blood Elf? Well, he was able to track us through whatever means they have. I can guarantee you that they have been watching your family's finances for large withdrawals. If we do it this way, we can at least keep your family safe. They probably have my family watched as well, just in case. Jolene looked away onto the horizon and took a deep breath. She knew I was right, but that didn't mean she had to like it. I took my free arm and wrapped it around her and pulled her tighter. We stood there for a minute to just enjoy the pleasant moment. About a minute later, my old friend came out with his wife in tow. Seems like they wanted a quiet place as well. They noticed us. They came out and sat on the swing. I turned my head a little and pulled the envelope holding $500 bills. I almost forgot, pulling the envelope out and holding it over to my friend. Payment for services rendered. He gave me a half grin and took the envelope. His wife said, "You're our guest. You don't have to do that." He looked over her and said, "That's the type of man he is. Always pays for everything he thinks he owes someone." He looked into my eyes again and then looked away as he put the envelope into his pocket. We were just silent for a while, looking over the fields. What the ladies didn't know is that he and I had a very long talk on the way back about what to do if things go bad for me in this contract. The money wasn't just for room and board. It was so that they would get Jolene back to her mother if I didn't make it back. In truth, it was far more than what they were needing. Consider her mother would send a security team to pick up Jolene. I knew that the emotional support required would be the tough part. This weighed extremely heavily on my mind, and I realized that she was thinking something similar. She tends to hold me tighter as she's nervous about something. I truly wanted to freeze time and stay with her right there, but I knew that it was only 3 days until showtime. Better make them memorable. The next couple of days were definitely some interesting times. Jolene, well, I don't know if she was nervous about the upcoming contract or something, seemed very affectionate at any opportunity. I mean, the night we came back from the meeting, we actually broke the bed. Actually did snap it in half. The funny part was seeing a bunch of other naked people run in with firearms thinking somebody had broken into the house. Yeah, completely bare. And that wasn't because they slept that way. As it turns out, my suspicions were right. Succubi radiate sexual energy, and anyone within range will feel very frisky. Now, we didn't experiment on the range, but we did find out that it didn't affect anyone that wasn't, starting puberty yet, at least. Well, thank God for that one. The ones affected that were awake couldn't get any sleep until they had released all tensions. If they were asleep, well, let's just say they had to do laundry in the morning. When we found this out, a couple of teenagers asked if I could invite their boyfriends or girlfriends over. Thankfully, they were smart enough not to ask this in front of the parents. We still said no. After a couple of days, Jolene and I being affectionate at every moment possible, we were asked to stop so that everybody could get some work done and get some meaningful sleep, of course. The night before the contract mission, Jolene and I ended up sleeping in the barn, just to make sure everybody was ready to go the next morning. However, that night wasn't exactly uneventful. The day prior, Jolene and I agreed to show the teenagers my transformation. Though they had to make sure that they were very ample food ready for us. They didn't disappoint either. In one of the living rooms, Jolene and I stripped down so as not to destroy another set of clothing. We told them as much. My old friend was there and had to tell his son to blink as he ogled my girlfriend. We decided to transform slowly, as this would not make us as hungry. I guess it has something to do with the aerobic type of movements inside the body. Regardless, my head was touching the ceiling as I finished my transformation. We let them know when we were done so they could ask any questions. They just wanted to look at what changes at first. Most began to circle around us to our wings, tails, bone structure, muscle tone. One of the girls asked me to kneel down so she could see my horns. There were a lot of questions we couldn't answer, mainly having to do with the fact that we didn't change the same way. Jolene has talons and horns that I don't, and I grow much taller and wider than she does. The questions persisted until I heard a smack. Jolene had hit one of the guys in the face with her tail when he had grabbed it. I got angry. You like grabbing tails? I used mine to wrap around his free arm and began to squeeze. Something you should know is that our tails are basically designed like a snake's body. They are pure muscle. So I could have broke his arm easily. My old friend had to calm me down before I released him. The kid won't scar, but that bruise won't leave him for a while. The kid claimed he was just curious about the length and girth and wanted to get an idea. It wasn't until then that, in reality, I hadn't even measured my transformation except for my height. Since half of them were information type folks, we decided that they could take measurements. At least this way, we could tell how far our transformations had really gone. I didn't tell them that Jolene's mother had ordered tests and they had measured things already, that I wasn't listening to the numbers when they did it. Call me curious, but I knew we would never see those anyway. As they started going through it all, it was clear that they wanted as much information about non-human parts as possible. I didn't mind too much as long as I got a good idea about the rest. This went on for about an hour, and before one of them on his computer said, "So it is possible." The young ones all smiled, but us adults were lost. Apparently they wanted to see if we could fly with our wings, and we were more for show. You know, kind of like a peacock's tail. An hour later, I was on the second floor balcony with my wings spread. Now, I've jumped out of planes before, but there's something about jumping without a parachute that just kind of sat wrong in my stomach. Thankfully, one of the ladies had made a type of elastic belted loincloth. Not that I was too shy anymore, but at least now I wouldn't have something that would rip off. Jolene and I got ready, and on the count of 3, we jumped off, praying that we didn't just go splat. Amazingly, we ended up gliding away. Now, there was a steep learning curve, and I will admit I crashed into more than one tree before I got everything down. On the other hand, Jolene took it to like an otter takes to water. I remember thinking, oh, right. She did say she knew how to fly before. I had just never pushed the matter, of course. We could only practice for a little while before it was time for me to go. We landed, transformed back, got a good meal, and the team was off. I will admit, I slept most of the way there. I think being my first flight, my muscles were just really tired. We arrived at our destination, and once we got checked in, we started going through our equipment. As I checked out my stuff, I looked over at our young guy. Man, does he love his pyro. I found out that this former boss got munched by one of those things, but took out the pin, and as he got munched, he ignited the thermite grenade before completely getting consumed. Now that was a bad case of indigestion. Seemed like everyone that had faced these things had at least one of those incendiary grenades for this very reason. My old friend really liked his explosives. Not really my thing. I can use them just fine, but they make me a bit nervous. I keep thinking something's going to go off in my pocket. Compared to the others, I didn't have a lot of equipment, though I did get some strange looks as walking around with a giant battle axe. Originally, I was just going to use my strength to chop one of these things in the leg so that we could get it on the ground. Now that I could fly, I had a better idea. Just as I was finishing up with a pair of guys walked up to me. I didn't pay them any attention until they spoke. "You know, it might be easier and quicker just to turn you in," one of them said. I pretended to be confused. "What? Turn me into what?" He continued with, "Don't pretend you don't know. If it wasn't for this job paying so much, your hide would fetch enough to cover us for years." I simply looked at him and said, "You got the wrong guy." He looked at his buddy for a second and turned back saying, "If we really want to get paid hunting a monster, maybe we just take you and your pretty little..." With that, I punched him in the face, knocking him cold. Now, I didn't transform, so I didn't kill him, but he is probably going to remember that hit when he wakes up. When I see the first guy's body hit the ground, I immediately start swinging at his friend. This one wasn't stupid and started backing up and trying to either dodge or deflect my strikes. After a few seconds, a bunch of people were trying to break up everything. As my old friend was pulling me back, the one still on his feet didn't say anything as I stared him down, letting him know that if he even tries to go after my girlfriend, I would tear him apart. I go back and I help my friend prepping his gear. I noticed that about an hour later, they decided to get on another fight. This one, much more verbal. But the fat guy they were giving shit to was not backing down. As he moved forward, I sensed something about him. I didn't think the fat guy was human. Later, when I was sure no one was watching us, I went and introduced myself to him. Nice guy, and definitely not human. Turns out he was a werewolf, and the only reason he had on all the weight was due to the way they transformed. They need a lot of biomass since his body didn't store it the way mine did. We came up with a plan. He and I would be able to get the heads into position. I could then relay the enemy position back to the main group and have them ready to bring hell down on these siren heads. My new buddy would use the radio, but once he transforms, he couldn't speak anymore. Maybe a few syllables, like the way a husky said, "Wow, wow, you," but nothing else could be used. He was all for the plan, since now he had backup. Turns out the original plan was just as foolhardy as another one. It wasn't long before we were on our location setting up. I helped my guys since I didn't have much gear anyway. As it turns out, everyone had a basic plan. But as far as how to draw the heads in there, wasn't one. As soon as we heard the sirens in the distance, my new canine companion and I just looked at each other and started to take our clothes. We didn't want to rip them, of course. Besides, jeans don't tear that easy, and it kind of hurts a little. A few people started yelling at us when they finally noticed. Right before I changed, I spoke into a headset, "We got this." I began to transform, as did my new friend, as the entire group got quiet. Though I had wings and a tail, I will say that seeing a fully formed werewolf was a first for many of them. I would keep their attention. I put on my gear and got ready to take off as the wolf did the same. One guy asked, "What do we do if we can't see them coming?" I responded, "Don't worry, the two vampires you have can see in the dark just fine." Everybody looked at the two I had gotten in a fight with. The wolf nodded, looked at me, nodded his head, and took off like a shot. I ran to the APC, parked in the middle, and with a running start jumped up to the roof and used it to catapult myself high into the wind as I could before opening my wings. I know they couldn't tell, but I was so worried the wind would quit and I would end up going thud. Instead, the wind kept picking me up and carrying me higher and higher. As I got away from the vehicles, it was difficult to see. It was a good thing that succubi have great night vision, or else I would have totally been screwed. I saw the wolf going through the trees and the open spaces. Wow, that guy is fast. I was having trouble keeping up with him, and I'm flying. Suddenly, he stopped dead and seemed to point. I looked in front of him, and sure enough, I could see 3 of these things heading our way. Only one was fairly close, while the others 2 barely moved. The wolf howled into the night to get their attention, and it worked. The closest one began to run our way. I tried to contact the main body, but no one answered. The wolf could hear me and knew I couldn't reach them. There wasn't time to worry. The first one was getting close, fast, and it blared its siren as the wolf turned and ran back as fast as it could. I had already turned my back to get contact with the main body. I could hear the wolf clicking on the radio, trying to let them know what was going on. I could see all sorts of movement, so I kept trying my radio between that damn siren head blasting that god-awful tone. Even when I could get a moment, too many voices were trying to talk to each other over this. Is some sort of social media? When there was a break, I jumped in and said, "Finally, I thought you all would never shut up. There are a total of 3 of them coming in from the west. Estimate 90 seconds. I could hear yelling and weapons turning as I saw the head getting dangerously close to our wolf. Suddenly, the wolf went into a full sprint. He was already using 4-wheel drive to keep ahead of the creature, but I had no idea how fast he could get. I was too high up, but I swear I could hear him panting. He howled again right before he broke through the tree line and covered 100 or so meters to the vehicles by the time the head broke through the tree line. I could only watch as projectiles flew in its direction. It looked like it had been half hit their target, making the creature tumble. Then I saw something fall behind it as it fell over. Somehow, they had gotten a direct hit into one of the joints of the siren's legs with one of those funky harpoons and cut it clean off. It let out some strange type of siren, almost like the scream of a child and that of a bear that's injured. I didn't know if it was in pain or calling for help, but it didn't seem to matter. With each hand, it began to pull itself towards the main body of those hunters. Another head entered the line of sight as I see the truck break formation and drive at one that lost its leg. I screamed in the mic, don't, there's another one. They tried to back out, but it was the new head came out and was able to knock the vehicle over. I didn't know if it had killed anyone, but there was a sudden burst of fire coming from the trucks as new bladed harpoons and weighted balls hit this new one. It fell over like the other tree. It blared out another tone, and I saw the last one start coming our way, but it wasn't running. In fact, it seemed like it was trying to flank around. I yelled at him like, "Now is your chance. The third one's trying to flank around behind you. Take the bastard out." And boy, did they. They laid into those things on the ground with a vengeance as I watched the third one go around and begin to circle the main body. Our wolf began to howl in order to bait it out in the open, but this one was smart. It looked for an opening, and just when I thought it was ready to charge, I called its location. It seemed to notice when they all turned their weapons, and it would reconsider the charge, blaring its siren in almost frustration. I was trying to think of my next move when the wolf decided it for me. It charged the head and used its impressive speed to jump out of nowhere and take a strong swing with its claws. The head seemed to start rambling off words and thrashing around in the trees. It kept swinging at the wolf, swinging hard enough to knock a massive oak tree over. Maybe he saw an opening at that point, I didn't know, but the wolf tried to bite a piece out of this thing. As the head tried to reach down to grab him, I knew I had to do something. I folded my wings and drew my axe and dropped onto its back, driving the axe as deep as I could. I screamed all sorts of obscenities as the blade went several inches into its back. It went in deep that I couldn't even pull it out. Luckily, it stumbled into the line of sight of the trucks. Unluckily, it stumbled into the line of sight of the trucks with me still on its back. I thought I heard my friend yell something when one of those weighted balls wrapped around this thing, almost taking my head off. As I let go and tried to fly away, but all I could do was soften the crash. I rolled over and pulled out a pair of Desert Eagles and unloaded them as more projectiles kept coming in. Once I emptied it, I didn't reload. I saw that it had kicked off our wolf. The wolf wasn't moving much, and one of its legs looked twisted. If he was like me, he would heal fast, but just not fast enough. I rushed in to get him and carry him back to the perimeter. I got us to the medics, and they tried to patch me up, but I told them to get the wolf's needs more attention. My friend yelled something to me, and I just gave him an okay hand signal. I looked over and saw something beautiful. The last siren was down. There were cheers, and I could hear beers being opened as everyone started to celebrate. I took a deep breath before hearing something I really, really didn't want to hear. In the distance was the unmistakable sound of a siren, and it was getting closer very rapidly. I tried to get in the air, but one of my wings was busted. So I grabbed one of the harpoon heads and the one that made out of depleted uranium, and I got it ready to load. I could hear it running, definitely not trying to be quiet, as it blared its siren and spoke indistinguishable words. Then there was a deafening silence. For about 5 seconds, you could hear a mouse fart. Then a crash as the head landed almost in the center of our perimeter. My friend fired, as well as everyone else. The creature thrashed as random words belted out of its speakers. Several trucks went down nearly as fast as they started to shoot. My friend fired, hitting the creature, but not lacerating it. I jumped up and slammed the final harpoon head into its place. We pulled off the protective coating, and just as the creature seemed to notice us, he fired. The harpoon was made of the strongest metal known to man, which is also why it was so heavy. The siren winched in pain and then proceeded to swing at the truck. In a moment, we lost the vehicle and we went flying. As I got to my feet, the new kid ran over. My friend told us to grab this specialized ballista we used. He reminded me that we've only got one shot. He took the small box from it and me with the new kid and ran close to the creature. We got within 10 meters and I held it in place while the new guy aimed it. He fired and a specially made bolo came out and wrapped around that giant bastard. As I dropped the ballista, the bolo itself exploded. This sent me flat on the ground. By the time I was able to look up, I could see that the head was on the ground in 2 pieces. With that, this fight was over. No one cheered this time. All we tried to do was keep our wounded alive until the recovery team got there. I aided in recovery, staying in my monster form because it gave me a little bit of a strength boost. Must have worked horrible, covered cuts and bruises like that. Had to tell my team, almost individually, that I would heal just fine as long as I got enough to eat. As we loaded the last guy on stretchers, my friend remarked that my loincloth had been ripped almost completely off in the fight. Now, I was kind of hanging out. I tried to joke and say, "Yeah, bitch tried to rip my dick off." Enough guys laughed, so I guess I lightened the mood on that one. I was still a monster form when the recovery team showed up, but then I had to cover myself so as not to scare them. They gave me a ton of looks as they started treating the casualties. One of them kept trying to treat me while I kept backing up and saying, "I'm fine." Truth be told, I was too exhausted to fly, but had enough energy just to move away. Once they were done treating the other casualties, to include the 2 vampires and the werewolf, the entire recovery team tried to corner me to treat me. The fact that half of them were holding syringes, I knew what they truly wanted. Hell, I heard them asking all sorts of questions, but everyone there seemed to agree that I earned my right to privacy. When one of them pulled a pistol and yelled at me to submit, he found out really quickly that you really don't want to do that. Every hunter still standing pulled a weapon on them. Hell, even one of the vampires raised his Barrett 50 caliber. I reminded them of where they were and who they were dealing with. I was able to walk away without having to surrender anything, though you could tell the leader of the group was more than a little pissed. It wasn't much longer before we were out of there, and I was glad of it. I began turning back into my human form once we were on our way back to the compound. Surprisingly, our entire group had survived, though a little banged up. We got paid on the spot. Apparently, this is normal for them. And I counted up as we drove. Everything was there. In fact, there was a little extra due to what they call hazardous oversight, which is a fancy way of saying they fucked up and needed to make up for it. We stopped into a drive-thru and loaded up for the ride back. Well, between the fourth and fifth hamburger, I said, "You know, after something like that, sure makes you think." Everyone was busy eating, but most everybody not in agreement. "I think when I get back, I'm going to ask Jolene to marry me." Coughing erupted in the van, and it swerved a little. Guess they were caught off guard. Instead of words, it was thumbs ups and fist bumps. I was just hoping she would say yes. As we turned off the highway, our driver told us to turn any phones and other electronics off. I didn't have one, so I was a little lost. They did, and he flipped a switch on the dashboard. I could hear a slight humming build up and then some sort of strange burst. Everyone seemed to think it was normal and turned their phones back on. I asked him what the hell was that, and he said it was an EMP shockwave. Just in case someone was following the van, all their communication equipment just absorbed that wave and is now completely useless. The van itself is a mobile Faraday cage, and the devices inside are fine as long as they're powered off. Yes, my friend is that prepared. Within a half an hour, we were pulling into the long driveway of the compound. It was in the middle of the night, but the lights began to click on. Everybody knew we were back and ran out to meet us. Everyone got hugs before helping the injured ones inside. As we went inside, the teenagers were already talking about our contract being spread around the deep web. That is, if you know where to look, of course. They were so proud of us, they started showing us leaked footage, and it was a little embarrassing as the video of me hanging off the siren's back just came into view. Jolene was not happy about that. So I reassured her by saying that I would never do it again, nor that I want to, mind you. As the festivities calmed down, Jolene and I ended up going outside in the back porch. That's where we talked about our future. I asked what she saw in her future, after she said that she wanted to be free to make her own life somewhere where she didn't have to worry about her mother and sisters getting too deep in her life, where she could be herself without having to hide, just get away for a while at least. Then I asked if she wanted company in her future. She must have thought I was being funny because she giggled and held me tight. Pushing her head to my chest, I said, "Is that a yes?" She answered, "Forever, honey." I grinned. "Good thing you're not into jewelry because I don't have a ring." She looked up and smiled even more, then proceeded to lead me off the porch in the direction of the barn. I knew tomorrow would be the next step of our journey, but tonight was just about us.